Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to 1985. We're already more than halfway through the 1980s already. Can you believe it? It feels like just yesterday we were talking about 1979 in episode 1, and now we're already in 1985. I would actually say you should probably go back when you have some time and listen to some of the music that was coming about in 79 and maybe 80 and compare that up to what we're offering up in the Essentials for 1985. As we've been going along year by year, maybe you hear these little tweaks, these little jumps here and there. You might have forgotten a couple. If you listen to some of that stuff from episode 1 and listen to this stuff now, it's going to seem totally different, which is amazing that we've made these kinds of shifts in this little amount of time. It's pretty astounding. One thing I'll call out about 1985, though, is that it's a little bit like an eye of the storm, where when New Wave was first crashing onto our beaches, everything was wild and crazy, and all these new ideas were just flying left and right, and nobody knew what was happening. It was madness. And as of 1985, things have started to get a little bit quiet. But just around that ring, just around the outer edge of that quietude, is this really intense shifting that's happening. And so because of that, this year doesn't have too many essential albums to it. There's only 10, and there's only 2 conspicuous absences. But I would argue that these albums are creating some seismic shifts that are leaping us into what we presume to be the eventual return of the storm, probably in 86 or 87. So let's just take a minute to appreciate the world around us post the first half of this storm of the 1980s, look around, assess the damage perhaps, and then let's get right back to it. But before that, and we get into 1985, just a little bit of a reminder. Don't forget to go into the description of this episode to check out my essential playlist, which is going to be all the tracks for the albums that I'm calling out in today's episode. And then the bigger list, which is all of the albums that I decided to keep from 1985 because they were either impactful or critical to moving trends, or I just liked them a lot. So go check out both of those. Again, they're linked in the description of this episode. Okay, what are we going to talk about today? First of all, music trends. What's moving in? What's moving out? What's hot right now? As always. Next, essential albums for this year and why. And then finally, conspicuous absences from my essential list and why. Okay. Let's talk about music trends for a minute. So what's moving in? Electronica is, I would say, the earliest to moving in. It was previously underground. I think it's starting to find its legs a little bit. I think some of the subgenres of electronica are starting to take shape a little bit, and we'll talk about that a little more as we get into the essential albums. But I think it's officially moving in, much like it was last year. But it's still very early in its moving in phase. Next, Neo-Psychedelic Rock. I think that we were talking about it a little bit last year in 1985, but it was still very much on the outer edges. I think it's actually starting to move in now that we're starting to get a couple examples of people playing with these ideas of using the psychedelic rock conceptions from the 60s and moving them into 80s conventions, so neo-psychedelic rock. Next, twee pop is still sticking around in the moving in phase. Again, it's a long runway. I don't have any examples this year. I guess Tracy Thorn took a year off. That's totally fine, perfectly okay with it, but it's still moving in. And finally, neo-traditionalist country. It's still not exactly on trend just yet, even though the Reba McEntire album and the Judds album really pushed it forward. It's still not quite there yet, but I think give it 1 or 2 further big albums or popular albums, and I think it's going to be pushed right in. So get ready. What's hot right now? So hair metal was moving in. I think with that Rat album last year, I think hair metal is officially on trend. I mean, Bon Jovi is right around the corner. So I definitely think hair metal is on trend officially now that Rat's kind of brought it to the fold. Next, the golden age of rap. It's still happening. I would say that Run DMC has firmly planted themselves as the kings of the golden age of rap at this point. I think we still have 2 or 3 more albums over the next year or 2 that are going to continue to move that ball forward. But I think we can already detect that gangster rap is just right around the corner in order to completely supplant the golden age of rap. And we'll be on the lookout for it. It's going to be kind of an explosion. But at least for right now, the golden age of rap is firmly planted as the standard for rap at the moment. Brit rock. We've been talking about Brit rock here and there, especially a couple of years ago with Script of the Bridge by the Chameleons. 1984 also had some examples of the Brit rock movement moving forward a little bit, and then we'll have even more of that moving forward with 1985. It's very much what's happening right now in the world of British rock music, this new Brit rock idea. It's a little bit alternative, it's a little bit hard rock. We'll keep talking about it as it comes up. Next, alternative rock. It's been on trend for a few years at this point, so because of that, it is going to need to start changing its shape, pivoting and shifting a little bit in order for it to stay relevant, I think. For too many years longer, I think that grunge and pre-grunge and things like that are going to start pushing it towards the door a little bit faster, but those sounds aren't really taking shape all the way yet, so alternative rock is still at the top of the mountain, even if it's maybe starting to see the edge on the other side. Contemporary R&B, I would say what we consider to be the contemporary R&B movement of early Prince or Luther Vandross or early Chaka Khan or even Michael Jackson, I think is starting to get towards the end of its life cycle, with Whitney Houston coming in this year, spoiler. She's really kind of pushing where R&B is going to be going for the next few years at the very least. And then city pop, honestly, at this point, as unfortunate as it is, because I love city pop and most of the things that it brings, it's almost out. And truth be told, with one of the albums that came out this year, actually two of the albums that came out this year, were the first two shots at city pop, which is sad to see. But yeah, I think city pop is getting pretty close to being on the way out, unfortunately. So that one's teetering on the edge for sure. And then what's actually moving out? New wave synth pop is still moving out. I would say probably after this year, it's going to be officially passé, which is a sad thing to see. But because of that, as we've often seen, you find those albums that are giving it a fond farewell or a wonderful send-off, and we get another one of those this year. So we could just kind of enjoy it for what it is. Okay, let's talk next about our essential albums for the year and why. So first is Gene Love's Jezebel, Immigrants. It's neo-psychedelic Brit rock. What I love about this is how many influences it's bringing to the table in just a few of the tracks that I'm going to highlight here. So Always Aflame, Shame, Cow, and Worth Waiting For. You could probably hear all of the different influences that led them to this moment. Being neo-psychedelic Brit rock, you might be able to put some of those pieces together yourself. I'm going to call them out here though. U2, The Chameleons, and Ozzy Osbourne all led them to this sound, and it's really great just merging all these ideas together. I would also challenge you to maybe think about how this is a little bit like pre-Radiohead, because Radiohead is neo-psychedelic rock, but done in the mid-late 90s. So this is really early stuff that was probably influencing Tom York when he was thinking about putting together Radiohead, and he was listening to Gene Love's Jezebel more than likely to get some of that inspiration for what was to come with OK Computer and things like that. So this is really great, just kind of early examples of the neo-psychedelic movement. I really enjoy this album. It's really great stuff. I mean, I called out 4 tracks on the album. It's good stuff. Next, Jun Tagawa, Suki Suki Daisuki. So it's I Like You, I Like You, I Love You, for those that don't know Japanese. This album, I don't even really know if you call it punk. I don't even really know that you call it city pop. Maybe it's like evil city pop. I'm not really totally sure what to call it, but it's definitely counterculture. Like, there is no question about that. Jun Tagawa is like the queen of counterculture pop music in this era. I mean, she actually has a band that she's playing with kind of at the same time, and this is her solo career. Yapos is the band that she's with. There was an album, I think in 1984 in my big list that I kept from them. It's really great stuff. This is her doing her solo thing. It's a deeply disturbing album. And the thing is that you might be able to glean that just based upon listening to the music, that it sounds a little hopeless. It sounds a little anxious, not necessarily like Dead Kennedys or like Violent Femmes. It's just its own thing. And I feel like I have to explain this a little bit just so you get the full effect. So it's possible that some of you have been listening to some of the other J-pop that is in my big lists, like Seiko Matsuda, for example. I've kept a couple of her albums here and there, or Taiko Onuki that I put on the Essential albums a couple of years ago. And there's a lot more that's coming out that's like this sound. That just happens to be the best examples of it. And what Jun Tagawa is doing in this album is it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also it's playing with the sort of saccharine, virginal, antiseptic almost impression of female J-pop idols in Japan in the early mid-1980s. And the underlying discomfort with the fandom culture, also, I would probably even say this is providing a critique of young girl culture in Japan at the time, which isn't so great. There's a high degree of vulnerability to it. There's this high emphasis on being, again, like highly virginal, highly accessible, highly focused on love. There's a high focus on appearing very young. Like there's a lot of things that she's critiquing and commenting on in this album. Even if you don't really understand Japanese, there's still pieces to this where you hear it and go, yeah, I can understand and see where she's aping on pop conventions, especially in J-pop conventions. But it's really hard to detect in its entirety unless you sort of know the context about what's going on in Japan at the time, what's going on in J-pop at the time, and kind of how the culture is reacting to the J-pop idol movement in this moment. And so Jun Tagawa in this case is cutting through all of that and saying, this is actually kind of disgusting, guys. We really need to get a grip on how we're engaging with the idol culture because it's kind of uncomfortable. And everybody needs to take a step back from that and kind of reassess their priorities as a people. So in a way, it's like punk. It's definitely counterculture, but it's really, really excellent, thoughtful stuff, which again, if you don't know Japanese, might get lost on you a little bit. But just listen to the music anyway. Herikutsu boy. And herikutsu in this case is like a slang term for sophisticated. And Suki Suki Daisuki, the actual track. And then Angel Baby, which is written in katakana, so it is Angel Baby. But I would say you could go and listen to Angel Baby first because it's actually in English and you could hear the way that she sings it to give you an indication of how she's undercutting typical pop conventions. And then go listen to the Japanese ones, in Herikutsu Boy and Suki Suki Daisuki. And then you kind of know what she's going after when you don't understand the Japanese. But it's really, really great stuff. To me, this is one of those like official warning shots that City Pop is about to start falling down the mountain because of just how biting this criticism is about the current state of city pop and J-pop idoldom in Japan. It's really interesting stuff. And it's overt enough that it really does signal to Japanese listeners like, oh, I need to reassess how I'm engaging with city pop because there's a lot of a seedy underbelly here that I'm not really detecting when I'm just listening to this music and being a fan of these people. It's really cool stuff. I could probably talk about this album for a really long time, but we're going to move on. Next, LL Cool J, Radio. This is a golden age of rap album. This is also, I would say, a little bit gangster rap. I Can't Live Without My Radio, I Can Give You More, and then Dear Yvette. I Can't Live Without My Radio, I think, is just straight ahead golden age of rap stuff. It's one of his most popular tracks. But the other two are really interesting because I Can Give You More, to me, is going in that vein of storytelling that we're playing with a little bit last year with Fat Boys. And I think that I Can Give You More is going even further in that direction of doing more storytelling in rap rather than doing rap battling like I'm awesome and you're not great sort of thing, which that storytelling artifact is really akin to what happens in gangster rap, especially if you start to think about NWA or like Public Enemy. There's a lot more storytelling in some of these tracks. So LL Cool J is pushing the envelope on that one, which is great. And then on Dear Yvette, unfortunately, highlights one of the other key aspects of gangster rap, which I think is still something even today that we're struggling with, which is female disrespect. It is a very, very prevalent and popular artifact in gangster rap and continues to be prevalent. Not so much today. I think that there's an evolution that's happened off of that, and it happens a lot less. And it, I think, even comes across as quite passé to do the female disrespect thing today, especially because there's so many transcendent female rappers that exist that will completely annihilate these people in rap battles that I think that the lesson has been learned and they've taken that step back. But Dear Yvette is a clear example of this sort of female disrespect artifact that tends to exist in gangster rap. I mean, just give it a minute, and when we get to NWA, there's going to be a lot of that. And probably for the next several years, there's going to be a lot of that where we're talking about women, sleeping around, and that they're not to be trusted, and they're only out for my money, and things like that. So that whole piece about disrespecting women is part and parcel to this. Like, LL Cool J is a cool dude. He's really awesome. I hear and understand what he was going for in that moment, but like, can we deny that that was a critical component of gangster rap? No, we cannot. And he was just kind of following along with that trend. And give it a listen. If that's a trigger point for you, maybe don't give it a listen. But as far as being a musical time traveler, it is a critical moment in time that LL Cool J came out with this track because it was so much the beginning of this piece of the gangster rap puzzle. Next, Paul Hardcastle by Paul Hardcastle. This to me, yes, it's electronica, but this is one of those examples that I was talking about before about how electronica is starting to take some very particular shapes, and it's not just general electronica. This I would classify as intellectual dance music, or IDM, as opposed to electronic dance music, which is EDM. Intellectual dance music, I think, is just a little bit more thoughtful. There's perhaps a little bit of a critique behind it, or a commentary behind it, or a message. And Paul Hardcastle in this case does some of that, which is really great. 19 and King Tut are really great examples. You're just sort of sitting there listening to the music that, yeah, you could dance to it. Maybe you can find it in the club, but really it's meant to just kind of sit down and listen to it. It's a really early example of IDM. I would even compare it up to Haruomi Hosono from last year. I think that Paul Hardcastle is pushing that genre a little bit further. He's picking up the baton and running with it a little bit further down the track. I also think that much like Hosono, Paul Hardcastle is providing something that electronica, IDM, and EDM gives to the rest of music during this era especially, which is ideas for background track music. Not to say necessarily that artists like, pop artists, R&B artists are going to start using it specifically. Some of them do, but most of them don't. But more providing ideas for how we could be using some of these synths or some of the turntable ideas or some of the breaks, some of the stuff that these electronic artists are playing with that can be used in order to eventually sing over. So albums like this were pushing that envelope. This is definitely the beginning of that idea of there's R&B and pop music and rock music that's coming out right now, but also there's this electronic music that's happening at the same time that is helping to influence and inspire those artists to eventually sing over, which is really great stuff. One funny thing I want to call out, because we called it out with Thriller, Don't Waste My Time, the track on Paul Hardcastle is, I would say, even closer. I'm going to call out Sonic the Hedgehog 3 again, which is super funny. Sonic 1 hasn't even come out yet, and we're talking about Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Hydro City Zone 1, Don't Waste My Time are really, really close to each other. Like the world in which electronic music and video game music are starting to get close to one another. We're definitely walking down that path of electronic music eventually turning into video game music. We're getting really, really close. So if you have the wherewithal to go on YouTube, or I don't actually think that it's on Spotify, but go onto YouTube, listen to Sonic 3, Hydro City Zone 1, and then Don't Waste My Time. They're really close. They're really, really close. We're getting super close. Next, Size. That's how we pronounce it, but it's Psy like psychology, and then S, Size. They're a Japanese band. The album is called Different View. This is, I would say, new wave electronic pop. I wouldn't even call it city pop. I think that it's actually starting to push the envelope outside of what we consider to be city pop. This is actually that second shot that city pop takes in this year. Size, which may not necessarily be a very well-known band, perhaps, even inside Japan. I'm not totally sure at this point. It's definitely not known well outside of Japan. But Size is one of those, I would say, seismic shifts in J-pop that starts to turn the page from city pop pretty aggressively over the next few years. And this year is their first album, Different View, and they're just getting started. And we'll talk a lot more about Size as we go along here. The two tracks from The Planet with Love and Keshiki, which is the Japanese word, but the English word is scenery. There's just so much potential in this album and in Size just listening to this. For me, I didn't know about Size before I started doing this music project. Certainly not from the first time, and I only came upon them on the second time. And I was blown away by a couple different things. One was the competence of their instrumentation and the synths that were used for the background music, and then also the competence and the capability of the singer, because she's excellent. I don't even really know that you experience her full potential on this album. It might take a couple albums to really see what she's made of. And also the creativity and the many ideas that the background music DJ has for the rest of the music. There's a ton of potential just listening to this, just in those two tracks, where they can go. And trust me, they are going to go into a lot of different wonderful places that, as I said, will inevitably usurp city pop and make you completely forget about Henri. But it's just tremendous, amazing stuff, and it's definitely the future. Next, Tears for Fears, Songs from the Big Chair. It's new wave pop. Hey, it's the end of new wave pop, I would say. This to me is like the signal that new wave pop is over, or it is nearly over, right? Tears for Fears is officially saying we've evolved so far out of what we were doing with the Buggles in 1980, we're in a totally different place. We're in a totally different universe. We've evolved way beyond the bounds of where we thought this could be. And we've just so effectively integrated the synths with all the other ideas that we've been pulling together over the last 3, 4, 5 years across artists, across the genre, in order to come to this moment. Specifically, Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World specifically. they've just pulled together everything so competently into such a wonderfully consumable package. It a little bit feels like a send-off to the genre. And because of that, I just honor and respect them endlessly. Not necessarily for putting a nail in the coffin, but more just to say that they really figured out how to hit the heights with new wave pop. It's a triumph. The whole album is a triumph, but to me, Everybody Wants to Rule the World is like a triumph of new wave synth pop, period. Next, The Cure, The Head on the Door. It's, I would say, emo pop. I don't know exactly if it's rock. I wouldn't exactly classify it as rock. I would definitely call it pop, that's for sure. And it's going in that sort of emo direction that The Cure is known for, which is really great stuff. It's got a little bit of that Paisley thing going on, but there's like just a tiny little nugget of it so you can connect it back to what they were playing with back in the very early 80s, late 70s. And there's 2 hits for them on here. So In Between Days and Close to Me. In Between Days specifically is one that if you heard it, you go, yep, that's definitely The Cure. So we're here officially. I mean, remember when I said in 1979 that The Cure was not quite there exactly and they needed to do a little bit more work in order to figure out who they are? Well, here we are, 1985. 6 years later, I would say they officially figured it out. Because as we know, henceforth, The Cure is The Cure, and they are kind of setting the standard for, I would say, this brand of pop, because they're definitely their own thing. I mean, you juxtapose this to like Whitney Houston. These are totally different universes, totally different worlds. I would even say that The Cure and Tears for Fears, totally different. The thing I actually want to call out specifically about this, compared to when I was talking about The Cure in 79 to today in 1985, I want to honor the reconstruction that they did of their sound and how much hard work they put in being below the radar. Because for me, by all accounts, like I wasn't listening to Cure albums every single year that they were putting them out, if they were putting them out between 79 and 85. I just presumed they were toiling away in one form or another, and by 85 they had figured themselves out. But like, they put out that album in 79, I didn't think they were cooked yet, and by this moment they're totally who they're going to be until today for the next 40 years. And that's amazing stuff that they had the wherewithal to ask themselves all these important questions about how do we really push ourselves to create this distinctive sound that isn't like the Psychedelic Furs or like Echo and the Bunnymen. We're our own thing, and we're going to take the emo sections from Paisley rock and make it really poppy and accessible for, teenagers. It's just really cool stuff. It's kind of amazing. I specifically want to call out that artists like Morrissey and U2, I think, helped bring Head on the Door to fruition. That inspiration, I think, brought some of these moments together. Not to say necessarily that they were borrowing heavily from them, but it's clear that all the music that was coming out between 79 and let's say 84 when they were recording this was giving them some really critical inspiration to help influence them into these successes. And this transformation is just completely and utterly noteworthy. To me, it's one of the greatest transformational successes that we've experienced so far in this journey. So I'm calling it out that The Cure really sorted themselves out. And for that, I applaud them. And I'm astounded by their tremendous successes. Next, the Jesus and Mary Chain Psycho Candy. This to me is Neo-Psychedelic Rock for sure. It's also kind of got that wall of sound thing going on that's really popular in the 90s in general, early, mid, and late wall of sound idea. And when you listen to this one track that I called out, Just Like Honey, you'll hear that wall of sound where you're like, wow, I am getting annihilated by just the sort of wall of guitar music. All the tracks are like this. They're all really excellent in their own way. We're still really early in the Neo-Psychedelic Rock journey. And so I think that the Jesus and Mary Chain in this case was pushing that forward aggressively. They were pushing so hard away from all the other rock sounds at the time to try and take what was happening in the 60s, infuse some of that kind of noise pop, noise rock ideas that might have been bubbling up in the 80s, especially with punk music, and just turning it into this whole new thing. I would even call out Fang a little bit here. Like, I know that Fang wasn't sort of doing the droning thing, like, where it's kind of monotone a little bit, but there's a ton of influences that have led Jesus Mary Chain to this moment, even if it sounds distinctly different than what we were listening to a year or two ago. There's still those influences there, and we have to honor them. But having said that, this album is tremendously courageous in how far it's leapt forward in the we're going to take retro ideas and make them totally new and evolve them into this new great thing, more so than a lot of other bands are. Even, calling out specifically Gene Loves Jezebel. I think Jesus and Mary Chain in this case leapt out even further than that and tried something new and different and didn't necessarily have as much of a foothold in the sounds and the ideas of 85 and was more just saying, we're going to be completely focused on what was in the 60s and just try and update it for the inspiration that we have today and just kind of see where it takes us. And so because of that, they just leapt out with 2 feet into this retro neo-psychedelic movement, and it's really cool stuff. I really enjoy this album. It's a little hard to listen to in totality just because if you're not used to that wall of sound idea, it can be a little overwhelming, but besides that, it's really great stuff. I'd give it a listen for sure. Next, The Untouchables' Wild Child. This is ska revival plus a retro rock thing. And when I say ska revival, I'm also just sort of implicitly including reggae in it because ska is reggae. I mean, that's just what it is. It's been a long time since we talked about ska at all. I mean, I think the last time we meaningfully talked about it was in '79 with Madness. And that was, again, it was like 6 years ago. So because of that, there's finally another foothold in the ska movement with this album. And I would say that it's less obvious that it's ska than Madness One Step Beyond was in '79. This seems a little bit more polished. There seems like there's a little bit more going on than just straight ahead ska with horns and skanking and everything. It seems a little bit more accessible. It's a little bit more poppy. I'd like to believe that the reason for that is there's a little bit more of that retro rock component softening it up. Again, as we've been talking about for so many years, that this retro rock and roll idea is softening up a lot of this current music in order to make it more accessible. Again, it's super interesting. I think that what one could do is take this sort of transition in their mind between where reggae was and where it's inevitably influences and sends up to rap and contemporary R&B, akin to how rock and roll was eventually a send up to ska revival in this case. That there is this transition that happens and there are those heavy influences, but that's sort of the journey that the Untouchables are taking with Wild Child. It's really cool stuff. I really enjoy it. The tracks to call out: Wild Child, I Spy, and What's Gone Wrong. What's Gone Wrong is, I would say, straight ahead reggae. So you can hear how reggae and ska are siblings of each other because that's just why ska exists. It's taking reggae ideas and adding a little bit of that either big band or rock components or even punk components to it. So What's Gone Wrong is them calling out that connection by giving you some straight ahead reggae, which is really great. So if you want to hear the connection point, there it is. And then finally, Whitney Houston by Whitney Houston. She has 3 monster hits on this album: Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, and The Greatest Love of All. How Will I Know is her, I would say, jump out pop hit. Saving All My Love for You and Greatest Love of All are more ballads, which is more that Quiet Storm side. How Will I Know is more contemporary R&B. Whitney really jumped out in this case and is making her voice distinctive and heard in the landscape of R&B. Probably pop a little bit. How Will I Know is her first pop hit. I Want to Dance with Somebody's obviously like on the way, but that will obviously be her monster pop hit when I would say it is officially complete that R&B, at least on the Black culture side, has found its complete and utter footing in the pop side. And as a result, those universes are just completely merging with each other. Whitney Houston's the one that brings it together. Chaka Khan brought us really close to the threshold. I would say maybe even like 2 inches away from the precipice, and Whitney Houston just leaps right over the line and she's all the way in there. So it's coming. It's really getting really close. The one thing I will call out about this album though is it being her first album. Yeah, her voice is amazing. Yeah, she's doing the Quiet Storm thing, but there is a certain degree of reservation there. There's a certain degree of apprehension there where, yeah, she's doing these ballads. Even the album cover itself, she's a little bit reserved. She's definitely not got her like pop persona just yet. She appears kind of on the traditional side. It's very interesting. I don't exactly know what the background is of her coming across this way, both in the music, the songs, and the cover, but I definitely perceive that she evolves considerably in her persona, both in terms of the song she sings, how she sings, and how she presents herself over the next several years. But at least for right now, she's a little bit reserved, which is really an interesting play considering that Chaka Khan kind of blew the doors open as far as how one can present themselves in the R&B and pop sphere. It's just kind of an interesting call out. I'm excited to kind of witness Whitney Houston's evolution in that regard. Hey, that's it. Those are all the 10 albums that we're talking about for this year that are essential. It was really fast. Before we get to the conspicuous absences, though, I do want to call out something just to put it in your heads. Not in 1986, but in 1987, is when we start to get into the emergence of video game music. There's obviously been video games for the last several years already. Even before Nintendo, there was Atari and so on and so forth. So like video games have been around already, but the soundtracks haven't been bubbling up to the surface as far as either me keeping them in my big list or essential by any means. But what I'm going to start doing starting in 87 is there's going to be a little bit of a video game music check-in, kind of like we did the J-pop check-in. And inevitably, we will get to albums that are worth putting on the essentials. I'm absolutely certain of that. But in the beginning, what I'll be doing is just grounding you a little bit in what we're listening to or what's coming out at the time that might be noteworthy, but maybe not rising to the occasion of an essential album, just so that when we get to the really good stuff, you've got some context. So I'm just telling you right now, it's not 86, but definitely by 87, there's going to be a video game check-in, so get ready for that. Okay, so conspicuous absences. There's only two of them. One, Phil Collins, No Jacket Required. This might make several people feel sad, especially a lot of the people that started following the podcast because we talked about Face Value a couple of years ago, and that it was one of our essentials. And so No Jacket Required being a conspicuous absence might be sad for those people. Here's the thing. I really like this album. It's got a lot of good hits on it. I actually like tracks like Susudio, but to me, in Face Value, Phil Collins really kind of pushed himself and pushed the soft rock genre a fair bit. And as we said from that episode, he did Abacab with Genesis that year, and it didn't seem like his heart was nearly in it creatively compared to Face Value, where I thought he was completely clicked in to exactly what he wanted to do, to push some envelopes, and then he did it. I perceive that No Jacket Required feels a little bit like Abacab again, where, yeah, he's got some pop hits in there, but for some reason, there's just something missing with these tracks and these hits compared to Face Value. I can't exactly put the words to the feelings, but when I listen to this, it feels like it's a step backwards for him creatively. I'm not totally sure why. It's really hard for me to describe why, but I would encourage you, if you're not a big Phil Collins listener, give this one a listen and listen to Face Value. Maybe I'm totally wrong about this, but I hear it, and it sounds to me like he's kind of doing this sort of upbeat Abacab thing again, and he's not doing the kind of intense, maybe his own version of Quiet Storm, let's just say, and he's, like I said, totally clicked in. And instead, he kind of feels like he's sort of floating above the music. And yeah, I mean, he's doing it with skill and he's doing it expertly. But again, it feels like there's some kind of depth that's missing from some of this stuff compared to Face Value. Maybe that's it. Maybe it feels like it's lacking a little bit of depth, which maybe that's because he's moving more in the direction of pop music, and pop music often cuts out the depth in order to make it more accessible to other people. I'm not totally sure what happened there, but it is a conspicuous absence for sure, because it was like a monster hit that year, the whole album, and it's disappointing to not add it, but that's where my head went with it. And again, no shade on Phil Collins, because he's a tremendous artist, so sorry about that. And then finally, the Golden Palominos, Visions of Excess. The reason that I call this out specifically is I have a thing about supergroups. So this happens to be a supergroup gathered together by Anton Fear, and it's got a lot of great stuff in there. I would say that there's a fair bit of experimentation that's going on to a certain extent, insofar as you've got all of these big artists on there, like the lead singer from REM is there, for example. But the challenge that I usually find with supergroups is some of the music can be really great for what it is, but oftentimes with that many strong perspectives and strong inspirations from different groups that are doing different things at the moment, pulling them all together can make it extraordinarily challenging in order to gather a singular direction that one album should be able to take and thus push significant boundaries. I think that it's a good way to kind of bring people together that are all tremendously talented and just create really great stuff. But at the same time, it's just not moving anything forward really, which is a shame, because it's just a really great album for what it is, which is why it's conspicuous. Kind of like No Jacket Required. It's a really great album. In this case, Visions of Excess, I mean, I think it's actually kind of funny that that's what they named the album, because it a little bit feels like a vision of excess, an excess of talent in this case. And, because of that, they're just not really moving things forward too much. So conspicuous absence, but give it a listen on the big list if you really like that kind of thing. There's a lot of really great stuff in there. I mean, like I said, the lead singer of REM totally crushes it on this album. It's good stuff. But having said that, this is just my opinion. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Did you agree with me about Radio from LL Cool J? Did you disagree with me about what I said about The Cure, like being totally underground, under the radar, and then they popped up with the head on the door? Did you disagree with what I said about No Jacket Required? I'm sure that's a thing. I'm sure that there's a lot of people that disagree with me about that, and that's totally fine. What did I miss? There was only 10 albums that I called out for the Essentials this year and only 2 for the Conspicuous Absences. Did I miss anything, or was this legitimately a quiet year? You tell me. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. What did you learn about this year? I think with only 10 albums and maybe an hour 45 on the Essential list, you can really dig into some of this music here that maybe you've never heard before. So I'm curious to hear what you all learned from this. So in order to do that, just as a reminder, check out the Essential playlist and the Big playlist that I've linked in the description of the episode. Please join us again if you're interested in starting this storm back up in 1986, which I'm absolutely certain will start kicking up again in 86 and then 87. Please rate us and comment wherever you're listening to this, be it on Spotify or otherwise. Please find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Don't forget to subscribe if that's, if you want to keep going on this journey with us and you don't feel like remembering that we put these episodes out every Tuesday. That's totally up to you. In the meantime, tell your friends, tell your plants, tell your astrologist, whoever, tell your coworkers. Do whatever. Because like I've always said, we are doing what we can in order to gather everybody around some of this really excellent music that perhaps some people have missed, perhaps some music that some have not missed, but perhaps have not pulled the threads together about how all of this music in the great constellation and the universe of music relates to each other. It's possible that some of these connections that I'm making don't exist, and I'm just hearing what I want to hear. It's all totally possible. But at the very least, even with some of this music that perhaps is very challenging, like Jun Tagawa's Suki Suki Daisuki, that's pretty challenging music to listen to, especially if you don't know Japanese, but also just on the whole, it's really challenging music. But at the end of the day, even if, maybe the intention was for you to feel a little bit scared while you're listening to it, just because it elicits that emotion, the music itself is not actually scary. Maybe the emotion that was supposed to be elicited in you was fear, but at the end of the day, listening to it is not scary. None of it's particularly challenging in its own right. All you got to do is just put your earbuds in, put your headphones on, or just listen to it however you're going to listen to it, and just engage with it. Be curious. Ask yourself questions about, what does this make me feel? What do I like about this or don't like about this, and why? What kind of emotions does this elicit in me? Anything? Nothing? Do I have questions about where this artist was going when they were trying to make some of this music? I'm not totally sure, but I'd like to believe one day we'll find out one way or another. And in the meantime, just don't forget that none of this stuff that we're listening to is challenging or hard or scary. It's just music, right? Thanks for listening.